Hi, today we're thinking about exploring difference through the past. You may well have heard me say before that the center of gravity in solution-focused brief therapy has shifted since the early days. In the very early days, solution focus was oddly enough, past-oriented model. At the heart of the approach were exceptions, times when the problem didn't happen, times when the problem lasted a little less long, was less intense, or bothered the client less. And Steve DeShazer and his team, Milwaukee, had the idea that at these exception moments, the client already had a little bit of the preferred future, a little bit of the solution is the word that they would have used. The life that they wanted, the solution. And so the question then became how the client could do more of what worked. Now, this actually was a radical change in the world of therapy. The way that therapy could become a more of approach rather than a less of approach. Now, of course, you know that since that time, the center of gravity of solution-focused brief therapy has moved towards the preferred future. But nonetheless, this is where the model started from. Steve DeShazer and the team assumed that nothing happened all the time. Indeed, what they said was that if people were talking about an issue where there was no variability, where actually it happened all the time, then what people were dealing with was not a problem, but a life situation. They defined a problem as something where inevitably there was variability. Now, of course, life situations don't necessarily have that variability. You can't be less bereaved. You can't be, if you're facing perhaps terminal illness, you can't be in that sense less terminal. You either are or you're not in that sense. So in relation to life situations, Steve and the team proposed that actually what we needed to be talking about was coping with them and living with them. However, going back to exceptions, the team assumed that in those moments, people had a little bit of the life that they wanted, and the sorts of questions that Steve and the team would ask at those times were, if you like, strategy questions. How did you do that? And so Steve would ask, tell me about the times you're not depressed. And the client may, perhaps hesitantly, after a while say, well, yeah, there are times. Maybe not that I'm not depressed, but I'm less depressed. And Steve would say, tell me how you do that. Inviting the client to, as it were, take credit and responsibility for the not depressed days, or the less depressed days, or the days when I actually manage my depression better in that sense. And interestingly, that points us to another key feature of solution focus, that we only ask strategy questions, the how questions, retrospectively about things that people have done. So rather than asking the question, so how are you going to do that? A prospective strategy question. Strategy focus doesn't ask those questions. How are you going to do that? Those questions are too difficult for people. So what we do is we ask prospective, looking forward, we ask prospective preferred future questions. How will you know? What will tell you? What will be the signs? And strategy questions, we ask retrospectively. So when people begin to report those tiny elements of the preferred future that they have put in place, nowadays, of course, we'd call them instances rather than exceptions. But when people begin to report instances, then we can ask strategy questions. So how did you do that? What did you do that was a little bit different on that day that you managed to get out of the house? And we can amplify, if you like, the significance of those instances, as we would call them now, by also asking identity questions. Okay, so that's what you did to get out. What did it take? What did you draw on? What does it tell you about yourself that you managed to do that, even though it was really, really difficult for you to get yourself to do that? And we hear people actually beginning to describe themselves in the language of possibility rather than the language of limitation, of restriction. It took determination. It took strength. It took willpower. It took courage. So people begin to re-describe themselves in the language, as I would call it, the language of possibility, willpower, strength, courage. And then we can build with those questions. We can ask, for example, and would you like to see courage growing in your life? And people typically say yes. So how could you know? How could you know that courage was growing in a way that was good for you and good for your life? Or, of course, we can, as it were, consolidate courage in the client's life by saying, tell me about other times in the past when you've drawn on courage in a way that was good for you, in a way that actually you thought, yeah, this is the person that I'm meant to be. So, Steve DeShazer and the team, they got interested in the idea of exceptions. That was the center of their work in those days. Nowadays, we do it differently. We start by exploring a preferred future, and then typically in subsequent sessions, asking about, so what's been better? And as people begin to tell us about what's been better, they're telling us about those elements of the preferred future that have happened. And we can ask about times when, of course, they've happened in the past, exploring the instances and the how of those instances.